Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are in this world. God bless you. This is Gloria White coming to you from Utah, USA. Today we are going to be in the New Jerusalem Bible, Holy Bible, and we are in Second Maccabees Chapter 5. The subtitle here is Second Egyptian Campaign. At about this time Antioch was preparing for his second attack on Egypt. It then happened that all over the city for nearly 40 days there were apparitions of horsemen galloping through the air in cloth of gold, troops of lancers fully armored, squadrons of cavalry in order of battle, attacks and charges this way and that, a flourish of shields, a forest of pikes, a brandishing of swords, a hurling of missiles, a glittering of golden accoutrements, and armor of all kinds. So everyone prayed that this manifestation might be proven a good omen. Jason's insurrection, counteraction by Antioch Epiphanes. Then, on the strength of a false report that Antioch was dead, Jason took at least 1,000 men and launched an unexpected attack on the city. When the walls had been breached and the city was finally on the point of being taken, Menelaus took refuge in the citadel. Jason, however, made a pitiless slaughter of his fellow citizens, oblivious of the fact that success against his own countrymen was the greatest of disasters, but rather picturing himself as winning trophies from some enemy and not from his fellow countrymen. Even so, he did not manage to seize power, and in the end, his machinations brought him nothing but shame, and he took refuge once more in Ammonitis. His career of wickedness was thus brought to an halt. Imprisoned by Artas, the Arab despot, and escaping from his own, escaping his town, hunted by everyone, detested for having overthrown the laws, abhorred as a butcher of his country and his countrymen, he drifted to Egypt. He who had exiled so many from their fatherland, himself perished on foreign soil, having traveled to Sparta, hoping that, for kinsmanship's sake, he might find harbor there. So many carcasses he had thrust out to lie unburied. Now he himself had none to mourn him, no funeral rites, no place in the tomb of his ancestors. When the king came to hear of what had happened, he concluded that Judea was in revolt. He therefore marched from Egypt, raging like a wild beast, and began storming the city. He then ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy everyone they encountered, and to butcher all who took refuge in their houses. It was a massacre of young and old, a slaughter of women and children, a butchery of young girls and infants. There were 80,000 victims in the course of those 3 days. 40,000 dying by violence, and as many again being sold into slavery. Pillage of the temple. Not content with this, he had the audacity to enter the holiest temple in the entire world, with Menelaus, that traitor to the laws and to his country, as his guide. With impure hands he seized the sacred vessels. With impious hands he seized the offerings presented by other kings for the aggrandizement, glory, and dignity of the holy place. Holding so high an opinion of himself, Antioch did not realize that the Lord was temporarily angry at the sins of the inhabitants of the city, hence his unconcern for the holy place. Had they not been entangled in many sins, Antioch too, like Heliodorus, when King Seleucus sent him to inspect the treasury, would have been flogged the moment he arrived and checked in his presumption. The Lord, however, had not chosen the people for the sake of the holy place, but the holy place for the sake of the people. And so the holy place itself, having shared the disasters that befell the people, in due course also shared their good fortune, having been abandoned by the Almighty in his anger. Once the great sovereign was placated, it was reinstated in all its glory. Antioch, having extracted 1,800 talents from the temple, hurried back to Antioch. In his pride he would have undertaken to make the dry land navigable and the sea passable on foot, so high his arrogance soared. But he left officials behind to plague the nation. In Jerusalem, Philip, Phrygian by race, and by nature more barbarous than the man who appointed him, on Mount Gerizim, Androcus, Andronicus, and besides these, Menelaus, who lorded it over his countrymen worse than all the others. Activities of Apollonius the Misarch. In his rooted hostility to the Jews, the king also sent the Misarch Apollonius at the head of an army 22,000 strong, with orders to put to death all men in their prime and to sell the women and children. Arriving in Jerusalem and posing as a man of peace, this man waited until the holy day of the Sabbath, and then, taking advantage of the Jews as they rested from work, ordered his men to parade fully armed. All those who came out to watch he put to the sword. Then, rushing into the city with his armed troops, he cut down an immense number of people. Judas, also known as Maccabees, however, with about 9 others, withdrew into the desert. He lived like the wild animals in the hills with his companions, eating nothing but wild plants to avoid contracting defilement. Gentile cults imposed. Shortly afterwards, the king sent Gerontes, the Athenian, to force the Jews to violate their ancestral customs and live no longer by the laws of God, and to profane the temple in Jerusalem and dedicate it to Olympian Zeus, and the one on Mount Gerizim to Zeus, patron of strangers, as the inhabitants of the latter place had requested. The advent of these evils was painfully hard for all the people to bear. The temple was filled with reveling and debauchery by the Gentiles, who took their pleasure with prostitutes and had intercourse with women in the sacred precincts, introducing other indecencies besides. The altar of sacrifice was loaded with the victims proscribed by the law as profane. No one might either keep the Sabbath or observe the traditional feast, or so much as admit to being a Jew. People were driven by harsh compulsion to take part in the monthly ritual meal commemorating the king's birthday, and when a feast of Dionysus occurred, They were forced to wear ivory wreaths and walk in the Dionysus sack, Dionysiac procession. A decree was issued at the instance of the people of Ptolemais for the neighboring Greek cities, enforcing the same conduct on the Jews there, obliging them to share in the sacrificial meals, and ordering the execution of those who would not voluntarily conform to Greek customs. So it became clear that disaster was imminent. For example, two women were charged with having circumcised their children. They were paraded publicly around the town, with their babies hung at their breast, and then hurled over the city wall. Other people who had assembled in some nearby caves to keep the seventh day without attracting attention were denounced to Philip, and were then all burned to death together, since their consciences would not allow them to defend themselves, out of the respect for the holiest of the day. They were determined to keep the Sabbath holy, to observe all of God's laws. Providential significance of the persecution. Now I urge anyone who may read this book not to be dismayed at these calamities, but to reflect that such visitations are intended not to destroy our race, but to discipline it. Indeed, when evildoers are not left for long to their own devices, but incur swift retribution, it is a sign of great benevolence. In the case of other nations, the Master waits patiently for them to attain the full measure of their sins before he punishes them. But with us he has decided to deal differently, rather than have to punish us later, when our sins come to full measure. And so he never entirely withdraws his mercy from us. He may discipline us by some disaster, but he does not desert his own people. Let this be said simply by way of reminder. We must return to our story without more ado. The martyrdom of Eleazar. Eleazar was one of the foremost teachers of the law, a man already advanced in years and of most notable appearance, had his mouth forced open to make him eat a piece of pork. But he, resolving to die with honor, rather than to live disgraced, walked of his own accord to the torture of the wheel, having spat the stuff out, as befits those with the courage to reject what is not lawful to taste, rather than live. The people supervising the ritual meal, forbidden by the law, because of the length of time for which they had known him, took him aside and privately urged him to have meat brought of the kind he could properly use, prepared by himself, and only pretend to eat the portions of sacrificial meat as prescribed by the king. This action would enable him to escape death by availing himself of an act of kindness prompted by their long friendship. But having taken a noble decision worthy of his years, the dignity of his great age, and the well-earned distinction of his gray hairs, worthy too of his impeccable conduct from boyhood, and above all of the holy legislation established by God himself, he answered accordingly, telling them to send him at once to Hades. Pretense H. There's a misprint. Pretense, he said, does not benefit our time of life. Many young people would suppose that Eleazar, at the age of 90 had conformed to the foreigner's way of life, and because I played this part for the sake of a paltry brief spell of life, might themselves be led astray on my account. I should only bring defilement and disgrace on my own age, my old age. Even though for the moment I avoid execution by man, I can never, living or dead, elude the grasp of the Almighty. Therefore, if I am man enough to quit this life here and now, I shall prove myself worthy of my old age, and I shall have left the young a notable example of how to make a good death, eagerly and generously, for the vulnerable and the holy laws. So saying, he walked straight to the wheel, while those who were escorting him recently so well disposed himself. Excuse me, let me read that sentence again. So saying, he walked straight to the wheel, while those who were escorting him, recently so well disposed towards him, turned against him after this declaration, which they regarded as sheer madness. He, for his part, just before he died under the blows, gave a sigh and said, The Lord, whose knowledge is holy, sees clearly that, though I might have escaped death, from awe of him I gladly endure these agonies of body under the lash, and that in my soul I am glad to suffer. This was how he died, leaving his death as an example of nobility and a record of virtue, not only for the young, but for the greater part of the nation. The martyrdom of the seven brothers. Where are we at? Oh, we'll save that for next time. And that will be the starting of chapter 7. And as always, guys, I love you.